SECfans.com. Already done a couple of videos this week already. Got two more coming at you. First up, Mississippi State and Kansas State. The SEC is already kind of rolling early season, 13-1. We won't mention Tennessee's stubbing their toe, the one blemish so far in the SEC this year. Before we get into that, I want to remind everybody, Mississippi State fans, we did a lot of videos for y'all last year and the year before. Just want to remind you, if you like what we're doing here, make sure and give us a subscribe. It's helped us out so far. It gives us an opportunity to let you know what we've got going on besides just the game previews. We talk about your team, we talk about the rest of the SEC, and sometimes we venture outside the SEC, like we're going to do after this one for Southern Cal and Stanford. All right. Mississippi State, Kansas State. Last year, KState came in the SEC and played Vanderbilt and didn't have a great outing. This year, they're coming in without, a great start. They struggled with their cupcake last week. But last year, they ended up with an 8-5 record. They beat UCLA pretty badly in the bowl game. It seems like Kansas State is one of those teams every year that we're not in kind of the Snyder heyday era where 10, 11 games is kind of counted on. They've taken a slight step back, but they still seem to be steady. And they always lose a game or two that they shouldn't. Like last year, they were a better team than Vanderbilt. Let's be honest. Vanderbilt was a bad football team, and Kansas State by the end of the year was a better team than them. So they always seem to fall into a decent record, but you don't know where they're going to gather those wins that maybe they shouldn't along the way, or the wins that signify their team coming together and sort of making a run at it. So do you see, before we get into kind of where we're going to go with Miss State in this one, talking about K-State, do you see some more of up and down this year, or is that first cupcake struggle a bit of a warning sign for things to come for Kansas State? Is it finally that year where all the complainers about the Snyder era are proven right?
I think it's hard not to take it as a warning sign. And if anybody follows our channel, you'll know that we tend to be a bit stubborn in terms of sticking to the data and how teams do on particularly per play basis. The reason we do that, tempo matters. And in college football right now, if you look at total yardage, if you look at touchdowns scored, a lot of times it's more of a factor of who runs what style of offense, who runs more plays, and how aggressive they are. And a lot of times you'll see teams that put up, Louisville a couple years ago had a ridiculous amount of touchdowns scored, but they also had far more drives than most teams. They gave up a lot more points than most teams because they had more drives, et cetera, et cetera. Kansas State fans should be familiar with that on the other end. They run the quarterback so much, it keeps a running clock. They don't run as many plays as most teams. Well, if you look at what happened in that game, it wasn't just a close game against South Dakota, right? And I think you have the same opinion on this. It was an ugly game.
Yep.
You've got one quarterback going 5 of 14. That's 91 yards passing, 6.5 yards per attempt. And sort of as a baseline, 7.5 yards per attempt is competent. If you're under 7.5 yards per attempt in a game, the offense is struggling. You're not being able to throw the ball.
Unless you're a quarterback that's running for 150 yards a game.
Right. And even then, I would say the passing game is struggling, right? Because hopefully if you're running for that much, you can at least hit something over the top, but you can still get away with it if you're running that much. 6.5 yards per game, that's reminiscent of Jalen Hurts versus Clemson, Jalen Hurts versus LSU, to have the SEC connection there of what that looks like. That's very ineffective. And obviously being almost just above hair above 33% completion percentage is also pretty poor. And then the other guy, Skylar Thompson, which I think was arguably more effective in some ways in the game, particularly had a really long run that set up a score, helped them kind of stay in it. He's still 8 of 14, and more importantly, he only had 61 yards passing on 14 attempts. That's 4.4 yards per attempt. I struggle, frankly, to remember a quarterback having that low of a yard per attempt average in a box score. I mean, 4.4 yards per attempt is pretty darn low. So even though he was arguably the more effective guy, he was pretty darn inconsistent. So you take the two, put it together, and the offense isn't passing the ball well. You look at the running game. At least they're averaging over 5 yards per carry. Alex Delton probably still in the game. Has a higher per attempt average. Has a much better ability to run the ball consistently to 6.5 yard per carry average. But again, only 5 of 14 passing. And we talk about this a lot. A lot of football has to do with your ability to consistently move the ball and get first downs. And 5 of 14 isn't going to do that. And you're going to stall frequently if you're that inconsistent passing. Because again, if you throw 2 incomplete passes, then you have to have a 10+ yard run in order to extend a drive, no matter how successful you've been up to that point. So all around, just a poor performance. I think there is something to take away that the defense was solid. I mean, they held the other quarterback to 24-56. That's below 50% passing. 4.6 yards per attempt is pretty abysmal from South Dakota. It's not like South Dakota did anything well. 4.6 yards per attempt, 3.7 yards per carry. There's nothing here to be ashamed of in terms of what South Dakota was able to do. It's just this game. Well, this game ended up close in a number of different ways, but it's close because Kansas State can't score, and it's also close because, they throw a pick six here at the end of the first half and allow South Dakota to stay in it. But all around, just not an encouraging performance, particularly offensively.
Taking a step out of box scores and taking a step away from stats, Mississippi State is considered by a lot of people, they're the hot pick to finish second in the West, maybe a 10-win season. What we've seen so far this year is the West has the chance to be absolutely brutal, where there's a lot of beating up on each other, especially underneath Bama after what we saw with Bama against Louisville. Does that help or hurt Mississippi State if their goal is to finish second in the West and have a 10-win season? Does the brutal nature of week in and week out for all of these teams in the West help them or hurt them?
Well, so there's sort of two questions there, I think, and that's, does the scheme help them or hurt them, and does the situation help them and hurt them? And obviously, the fact that the SEC West is really good hurts them, right? The fact that Auburn is a good team, that LSU is a good team, makes it a lot harder to win the SEC West. The question is, if they're a lot better, then how do you beat them? And with Dan Mullen, we've talked about this a lot, but Mullen had a pretty poor track record playing ranked teams at Mississippi State, and when you have that kind of a track record, it tends to come a lot of times from scheme, because they were a good team. They had a lot of ranked games, but a ranked, when I say ranked games, I mean games where they were ranked. That's what I meant. Mississippi State struggled to beat ranked teams, I think, because they had a scheme that was very much spread based. It's obviously a rant and a dead horse on this show, but both of us are very much of the opinion that spread teams tend to struggle as the quality of competition goes up. What Mississippi State's doing now is they're running a more volatile offense. It's a big play offense. It generates a lot of touchdowns without a lot of production in certain types of statistical categories. But that sort of volatility, that ability to put points out of yards, tends to benefit you when you play better teams, because you may have a talent deficiency, but if you can take whatever statistics you're able to generate and you're able to score points off it, you could beat somebody even though you can't really necessarily outplay them. Even though maybe they statistically beat you, you win. I'm sure we're going to talk about this at some point with LSU Miami. That game happened while we're doing a lot of these recordings, but LSU statistically didn't really beat Miami by that much. But what LSU did in that game is they scored touchdowns. And at the end of the day, that's the goal in the game of football. And when you're playing a team that maybe has superior talent, and as good as Mississippi State is, they're going to be good because they have a lot of experience and a lot of returning starters, not necessarily because they're faster than the guys across from them. It's going to be that they're older, maybe a little more developed, and in that sort of situation, if you try to run a spread offense and you try to get the edge, you're not going to have the opportunity to get little dink and duck stuff and turn it around for huge plays against the great teams that the SEC West is likely to field. However, you start throwing bombs, and you're playing Alabama and you connect on a few of them, 21 point, you put 21 points on the board. That gives you a chance to win the game. And I think that's I think at the end of the day, that usually is a good thing. If you think you're probably going to lose the games anyway, and then I think that's the key. Do you think you would win them if you had the old scheme and you played it? I'm not even saying Mullen played it straight up, but he played it a lot, maybe a lot more standard and a lot more consistent offensively.
Yeah, and that's something we talked about last night in the Clemson preview for Texas A&M. We went last year when Clemson was playing Virginia Tech. We noted that Virginia Tech would not beat them straight up, and that they had to take chances down the field. And it is one of those situations where you look at it going into it and you say, okay, do I want a close loss that I know I'm going to have, or do I want to have a chance to win? And a lot of times they'll take the close loss because they want 8-4, they want 10-2. They're not trying to win a championship because they know it's not reasonable, so they're playing for the next best thing. What I like about what we see here is the potential to throw all that to the wind and say, look, we're coming out here to play to win. If we lose, we lose. If we win, we win, but we're going to put it all out there. So, but I will argue with you about one thing you said, in that it makes it harder for them to win the division or to do well in the West. So my question was, if the SEC West is harder, does it help them or hurt them if their goal is to finish second in the West? I think that chaos actually helps them, because theoretically, if it's harder, other teams are going to beat up on other teams. And so it takes away the need for you to go out and earn 100% of your own destiny. So if Auburn beats Mississippi State but turns around and loses to LSU, Georgia, and Alabama, that's great for Mississippi State. If LSU and A&M beat up on one another, that's great for Mississippi State, because it builds in a little bit of a buffer where they can stub their toe and they can lose to one of these teams and still win the division. Whereas last year, 11-1 was second place in the division.
Right, and I think that's a fair point. Last year, when you have a 2-team race, one of the 2 teams is going to beat the other team, and last year it was Auburn beating Alabama. And beyond that, they're not going to lose too many games, right? Auburn lost to LSU, but it's hard to jump that. The moment you have a 3-team race, you have the opportunity for everybody to get a loss and for you to jump someone. Essentially, with 2 teams, if it's a 2-team race, if you're in that situation and both teams are really good and likely to win out otherwise, one of the 2 teams is going to go without a loss. And that's hard. If you got a 3-team race, now you have much more of you have a much better probability that at least it's possible that everybody has at least one loss. So in that way, I think you're right. And that's kind of an interesting angle and we've talked about it a lot, that sometimes, I think a few years ago when, Ohio State had a loss and Penn State had a loss, and there was a whole conference champion issue where, Ohio State gets in the playoff, Penn State doesn't, that may not necessarily mean that they were good or bad. It may just mean you had 3 teams that were good instead of just 2. Last year, there wasn't probably as much parity in the Big Ten, and you end up with Ohio State getting in the playoff and not looking like they deserve it. So, I say last year, right? I mean, I'm sorry, I'm thinking of not 2017, but 2016, when Clemson comes in and punks them versus 2015, right? Okay, but in 2016 versus 2015, Ohio State comes in. They had a much more solid grasp on why they needed to be there. They get punked, and it's all wishy-washy. One loss versus no loss. But when you're talking conference records and you're talking about how and why a team finishes second, being in a situation like you said where there's more chaos, where teams beat up on each other, means there's more losses. More losses means there's more of an opportunity to get a win in there somewhere. Then you can win some tiebreakers and get higher in the rankings.
We talked a little bit about how Mullen struggled to recruit to this Mississippi State program at an elite level, but made up for it, more than made up for it, with his coaching ability. How important is it? And I know we said that you're actually really high on Morehead and you think that he's going to do pretty well here, but how important is it to sustain or improve upon the momentum that Mullen had in year 1 so to secure a little bit of recruiting momentum. And I ask this because the flip side of this is also a little scary to me if I'm a Mississippi State fan. If he takes a step back, then is he associated with, oh, well, Mullen's gone and that was the only reason there was success there, so I don't want to play there? How important is it, do you think? Or can he have a 7-5 type year this year, which I don't think he's going to have, but could he have a 7-5 type year this year and still sell it to recruits and still keep forward momentum?
Obviously, having a good season is always a good thing. And I think this is one of those questions where it's more about how much does it matter than if it matters.
Sure.
When you, it's like you watch a broadcast and the commentators sometimes will chime in and go, it'd be really good if they get a score on this drive. Because, there's drives where you just don't want to score. You were kind of hoping to get 13 yards and punt the ball, right? Obviously, you want to do well and get a better recruiting. But the question is, if you don't, how much does it hurt you? I think there's a fair point to be had that if Morehead struggles and he doesn't establish himself quickly, it puts you behind the eight ball. You can't recruit as well the next year. Maybe you don't recruit as well this year, so you can't get the kids you need to take the next step. So you do poorly again, so you can't recruit again, on and on and on and on. You got to get a little right. You need to get a little bit there to start moving forward, get gets in place. Both of us have commented on how difficult it is for Mississippi State to get across the hump, to move forward. And I know my take on that, which is I don't know if it was Mississippi State, the program, or if it was Dan Mullen, but they never recruited at a high enough level, in my opinion, to ever quite take that step. And a lot of times, both with Mississippi State fans and I think national media would be expecting Mississippi State to take a step. And I was always skeptical of it. And if you remember a few years ago when they played Alabama, and I think Russell was the quarterback, and they went into that game like undefeated, and they were a top 10 team.
I think Prescott was quarterback that year. They were 10-0 coming in the game. Then they lost. It was like 26-21
Yeah,
or something like that.
maybe well that I'm remembering it because it was multiple times that it happened. But they'd get into November, and as much as they got hype, they'd hit the hard part of the schedule, and they didn't have the talent to compete well enough to win because they don't have enough depth, and they don't have enough upfront talent. And at some point, Jimmy's and Joe's win the football game. If they want to take the next step, that's got to get better. And if you want that to get better, then Joe Moorhead needs to have some successful seasons to get it better. So obviously, you want to be successful out of the gate. But given that they were very successful last year, which is not always something that happens with coaches, right? It's pretty rare for a coach to inherit a situation where a team had a good record coming in. I do think it definitely matters how successful Mississippi State is right now.
Yeah, I think it makes it harder. If you're coming in, like Nick Saban came in to an absolute disaster in Tuscaloosa, especially relative to expectations. It didn't have a great year in the record books. I think it was 7-6, 7-5, something like that his first year. But he was already bad, so I think it was a little easier on him. If whomever comes in next inherits a national championship 11-1 type team and goes 8-4, that's going to be really hard to sell to recruits. So I think you're right. It is a unique situation where he's stepping into a Mississippi State program that in some ways would be easier on Morehead himself if he stepped into a 6-6 team, if he stepped into a losing team instead of a team that's used to winning. So enough about that sidebar. Let's talk a little bit more about this game. So Kansas State, to me, I think it's interesting because they have enough talent and enough, I guess, being accustomed to winning ball games that they can, on paper, at least mentally, present a challenge to Mississippi State. My concern for Kansas State is that what we talked about yesterday, we talked about how Louisville is the example we used, in that Louisville brought a really good quarterback and really good wide receivers to the game against Alabama. But it was clear from the start that they weren't going to be in it because they didn't have the talent on either side of the ball on the lines, on the front. So offensive line was okay. Defensive line was not great at all. And we see a lot of these programs that don't recruit 5-star city, but they still manage to have these top flight skill position players. But with Kansas State, it seems like this year they don't have the SEC level front seven on defense or offensive line that Mississippi State is used to facing, and they may not have the skill positions to make up any of that margin. Is that something that you're seeing with Kansas State, or am I reading way too much into this first game struggle?
It's always hard. Kansas State is so dependent on transfer players that when you examine them early in the season, you don't know who they are. And it's not like it's unprecedented by any means for Kansas State to lose FCS games, right? I mean, they've done it in the past. And usually when that happens, um, it hasn't meant a whole lot about what they were going to be in the future. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I don't think that they really have the talent to hang with an SEC team. And I know that's cliche. For those that aren't familiar with the show, that I try not to deal in cliches. I know you don't try not to deal in cliches, but it is probably true here, right? I mean, at Kansas State, probably doesn't have the Jimmies and Joes to go against an SEC team, especially if you're dealing with junior college prospects, because at the very least, these are guys that either weren't wanted as replacements at elite schools or guys that didn't make it at elite schools, and then just in general. And given their style of offense, I don't think it's a good thing when you're relying on a a dual threat quarterback in a power spread run system, and you're playing against a team like Mississippi State, who, while they lose, I think a lot more guys in the back seven than it's given credit for. Now, I'm not sure if that's a good or a bad thing, given that the pass defense hasn't been all that great the past few years. But certainly in the front four, Jeffrey Simmons and Montez Sweat are truly elite players, and that's something that you just wonder if just from the gun if Kansas State can deal with it. And we had again these same sort of conversations with teams that play Clemson. The first thing you got to do is be able to survive the defensive line in the game of football. If you can't deal with the defensive line, nothing else is going to work for your team. And I don't know that Kansas State can deal with Mississippi State's defensive line. And if that's the case, especially given all these other warning signs, it's not a lot of confidence that Kansas State has the ability to win this game.
Kansas State fans do know that there's a lot of SEC fans of SEC football programs that we piss off. So we're not just like SEC homers. I'd say half of our subscription base is probably outside the SEC. So we're not saying, we think Mississippi State's going to kill Kansas State because Mississippi State is some great SEC team and the SEC is unbeatable. It's more what we're seeing in Kansas State right now that's at least ringing some alarm bells, but there's also the possibility that it was just an early season slumber. If they do lose this game, the complaints about Snyder continually getting contracts in Manhattan there and being that fixture while the program sort of slowly but consistently slides downward, I wonder, because he brought Kansas State out of such just despair to be such a stable program, is that stretch an aberration, or are they keeping him on too long and it's going to become a situation where if they would have just cut the cord, let's say a couple of years ago, they could have built on some momentum that they had and brought somebody in there and really done something in that program? Or is it just hard to win in Manhattan, Kansas, and the administration knows that and they're sticking with him because of whatever reason, but they know that whoever else they bring in there is going to be a tall order and it's going to be hard to get somebody there?
So in 2002, Bill Snyder goes 11-2. 2003, he goes 11-4, and then the next year they go 4-7, and they go 5-6 after that. So they make the call to fire Bill Snyder, kind of taking my advice, right? They've got a coach that 4 of the past 5 years he's got 11 wins, and then when he goes 2 losing seasons after that, we're going to let him go because we seem to be heading in the wrong direction. They bring in Ron Prince. He goes 7-6, then he goes 5-7, then he goes 5-7. There's no hope of improvement. You pull the trigger again. But when they pulled the trigger again, they went with Bill Snyder. Back with this guy they'd left before, kind of comes back out of retirement. I say they got rid of him, right? He retired. I'm sure there's going to be comments here on Kansas State fans of whether he retired, whether he left, what the terms were. That stuff's always nebulous. Snyder, when he comes back, turns the program around. They have winning seasons. He goes 6 wins, 7 wins, 10 wins, 11 wins. And then they start to slide to 8, 9, back down to 6 in a losing season, then to 9, then to 8. He's been pretty darn successful. So at this point, there's not much reason to get rid of him. But to what you were saying, if he does slip, if he does fall, at what point do you need to let him go again? And if you do that, are you willing to risk what you had happen with Prince? I don't know. I don't know the answer to it. I will say, as successful as they were with Snyder in 10, 11 win seasons, I won't say that it was by any means a bad call if you're Kansas State to end up at a top 15 team. But I don't think it moved the needle all that long term to move back to Snyder. Maybe they could have been in a different place. It's easy to assume that Snyder is the only reason they're at that level. Maybe Kansas State could be more successful. We won't know. I mean, they haven't finished ranked now in 4 years. So we'll have to see what happens. I think you got to give him more of a trigger. And then if you're a Kansas State fan, you look back at it and say, well, when we had a fast trigger before, replaced a hire, didn't work out, we had to go back to Snyder, and that's the only reason we're successful. But at some point, Snyder is going to fall off. And when that happens, if you let it drag out too long, we give the Tennessee example, and that's going to come back to bite you.
Back onto this game, let's go ahead and make some picks. Before we make the picks, based on what you know about Kansas State and what you know about Mississippi State, what has to happen from, like, let's say if we're taking a Kansas State game from last year or the team they were last year, what does Kansas State have to look like in this game from Kansas State 2017 to come away with a win, and how feasible do you think that is?
I think that if you're Kansas State, you've got to end up being a team that you weren't last year. I think is the shortest answer to that question.
Well, I mean, 42-35 against Oklahoma, like that was, to me, that was a good game for them. They actually should have won that game. You don't want to be 14-7 to Vanderbilt; you get killed. But they beat Texas Tech in overtime. They barely lost to West Virginia. They beat Oklahoma State. So I feel like we're not that far removed. We're not 3-4 seasons into a 4-8 consecutive type team at Kansas State. Like, this might be the first year of that, but we're not. We're one game removed from a Kansas State team that went 8-5, that beat Iowa State, that beat UCLA, and beat Oklahoma State to end their season. So I know we hate talking about year to year because so much turnover happens. But I'm just trying, if I'm doing anything in Kansas State's favor, and I'm trying to put some winning shoes on this program. Last year wasn't an absolute disaster. It wasn't. They lost, except for Vanderbilt, all the teams they lost to, you could say they were respectable losses. They only had one loss that was by more than one score, and that was TCU. I don't. Maybe it's an unfair question because, again, we don't do year to year, and y'all, we are struggling a little bit to put something together on this because we're so data driven and there is no data. But let's take one off the board. If the team that beat Oklahoma State 45-40 last year shows up, how much of a chance do they have to beat a Mississippi State team that Fitzgerald's probably knocking off some rust? And I know you don't like quarterbacks coming off a leg injury that are mobile. Help me out.
Okay, so there's sort of two sides to that coin, and you jumped on me pretty quick there, but there was a point I was trying to get to, and that's Kansas State last year, even in their wins, gave up a lot of points. If you looked at their statistical profile, Kansas State was in terms of total defense, S&P plus 78th nationally. And they were that's just not good enough, frankly. If you want to be winning these kinds of games, you got to be able to play good enough defense. Now, how do you get around that? It's by playing good offense. What did they do? How did they end up beating Oklahoma State? They outscored them. How did they keep those games close late in the season last year? They scored, and they did it with a balanced dual threat attack, just like they have through most of, if not all, of the Bill Snyder era. So, um, for Kansas State, I think the answer is sort of twofold. That you need to be solid in run defense, which they were at times, but not always. And you need to be able to move the ball consistently in a balanced fashion. And to do that, as we said earlier, it's going to be more about being able to control the defensive line at Mississippi State to enough of an extent that you're able to operate your offense. If you can do those two things, then you can be successful in this ball game.
So, how much does it help them that they play in a league that doesn't play power run or I formation or pro style offense? They play something similar, not entirely exact, as what Mississippi State's going to employ Saturday. How much does it help a Kansas State that they've seen this before? There's really nothing that Mississippi State, aside, I think, from the raw talent on the front four, week in and week out, at least offensively, so front four and defense. Offensively, I don't think Mississippi State's going to throw that much at Kansas State that they haven't seen before. So I asked this question because they held West Virginia to 28 points, TCU to 26. How much do you think that benefits them?
This is a two-way street, in my view. The question is, how much has Mississippi State seen what Kansas State does? How much has Kansas State seen what Mississippi State does, right? And I think the fact that Kansas State is familiar with it will help them because it's honest. If you're looking at what they ran last year, these offenses are pretty similar. I think you'd agree with that in terms of how they're predicated on the running quarterback and the way they use the passing game. The quarterback's even pretty similar last year. But I think my concern is I think Mississippi State sees this style of offense in the past couple of years more than maybe even Kansas State does in terms of the guys that run with power. Alabama with Jalen Hurts became a run spread team. Auburn, for recent memory, has been consistently a run spread team. You can argue whether they were or were not last year. I don't know that Kansas State sees teams that have this kind of power and this kind of offense with all that much frequency. And their defense has an advantage because, to your point, the defense goes against the offense. The offense runs a similar scheme, but the defense at Kansas State, I don't think, can quite replicate Mississippi State. And again, Mississippi State has several years of experience running against similar offenses. So at the end of the day, I have to think that also benefits Mississippi State.
All right, so we're still in a hypothetical world, but let's go ahead and talk about scores. Tell me who you got in this one.
I've got Mississippi State in this one, and we've kind of bounced around a lot, but I honestly don't think it's all that close. I think Mississippi State, their defensive line should be able to disrupt and control the line of scrimmage. I don't know if their back seven is or is not good at this point. I don't think we have any clear clues. I don't think we're going to get any real clear clues out of this game either, given how poorly Kansas State was passing the ball in their opener. That they were pretty mediocre. So I do think Mississippi State wins this game. I think they win this game by a comfortable margin. I'm thinking something like 34-10.
I'm trying to see the angle here where Kansas State is competitive in this game. And, again, going back to the fact that, like, one of us picked Miami. No, both of us picked Miami in the Miami. I can't remember. At least one of us picked Miami in the Miami LSU game. We frequently pick SEC teams to lose. I don't see it happening in this one, and I don't think it's even as close as you think it is, because part of me feels like Aeris Williams could just run all day if he needed to. And so, yes, I think Fitzgerald might be a little sluggish coming back. Both of us hate mobile quarterbacks coming back off a leg injury. We hate it. We hate it. We hate it. I think they could beat Kansas State with Thompson, who I'm really high on, even if Fitzgerald wasn't there. So I'm going to go 41-13, and I think Aeris Williams has a day that outshine, because there was some low chatter about Fitzgerald maybe having a Heisman campaign this year. I don't think Fitzgerald's the guy. I think missing the first game of the season hurts him a lot, but I think Aeris Williams ends up first or second team All SEC running back this year. I think he's astounding, and I think he's going to show out in this game. And I hate to say it because I love Bill Snyder, I think this is the beginning of the end, and this game will mark that. I also think that the Mississippi State, if they get a chance, they're going to put their foot on the gas because they're going to try to make a national statement in this game. They probably feel a little bit disrespected at 18 when you got Miami's of the world ranked at 8th coming into this season. So I think they're going to try to make a statement, which will be good for the SEC. And look, if there's Ole Miss fans listening, if there's Alabama or Auburn fans listening that want Mississippi State to lose because they're going out of conference, remember that anything out of conference helps your team, even if it's your rival. It helps your team 100%. If you need a little bit of margin for error and you're trying to get into a better bowl or better playoffs or opportunity, anything like that, then the perception of the conference matters when it comes to your team and they're being evaluated for the postseason. So remember that. Anything else to add on this game?
I don't think so. I mean, I think we kind of beat this one to death based off what's available to us.
Yeah, and y'all, these early ones are just tough. I mean, we have a computer model that we bring out in week 4 that's got a lot of data behind it, and it gives us a lot of talking points. We don't have much to go on in this game, in any game in the preseason, but in this game in particular. And especially when we try to be balanced to both fan bases and give both fan bases airtime. And given the first week that Kansas State had, it made it a little tougher on us. We could talk about Mississippi State all day long, but we had a hard time, Kansas State fans, coming up with some stuff in this one. So maybe we'll have something to discuss after it. We'll see. But for both of us, I don't think we're deviating too far on this. Both think it's a pretty comfortable win for Mississippi State.